kill zone is basically a tactic in defense where you are seeking to do two things. First of all, channel the enemy towards a certain area, geographically, terrain-wise, and then bring all your full effects of your firepower into that area to create exactly what it sounds like, an area where you kill as many people as possible in a place where you want to kill them. So the channeling is really important too, as best as you can. And they're usually boxes. If you're thinking about on a battlefield, you box off an area, and then that's where you started to coordinate all your fires into that. So the other element to bring in is then, the more complicated level is how your defensive obstacles and your defensive positions interlink to create multiple kill zones across a defensive line. And so, for example, you may have the channeling by the terrain, so a road, for example, or a forest, away from areas which can be covered from, traditionally covered from view. And then you could have, for example, minefields, into then trenches, pillboxes, and then, of course, you have your fires behind that, which would traditionally be artillery. Now, what you're seeing across the Ukrainians immediately in 2022 started to build deep anti-tank trenches, defensive positions, etc. In the east, basically as a defensive belt, numerous lines in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk kind of area. This is the last area, the major cities in the Donbass region, which of course Russia wants to capture, probably, potentially would call a halt if it was able to capture them and declare mission accomplished in terms of taking the whole of the Donbass. The Ukrainians don't want to do that, so they built these major defensive lines. But, defensive lines aren't really that good. You see them in the Second World War. They have to be where the enemy is going to come. Otherwise, it's just wasted effort. And certainly there were reports, even with the civilians who built some of these defensive positions, that they were actually oriented the wrong way for the terrain. So they, the civilians who were building them in a rush with a lack of military preparedness, had actually positioned some of these in the wrong way. But nevertheless, right, there's these large defensive belts, but they're not that useful unless you get things right in terms of what the overlay is of the fire and the threats. So what's emerging with the Ukrainians and the way they've really been able to slow down the Russians now in these areas is the integration of, first of all, drones, so the different kinds of drones. So we have the FPV, which are basically single drones which target soldiers or vehicles, etc., with usually an RPG warhead, so an anti-tank warhead, and they are ubiquitous. There's thousands, tens of thousands of those flying every day. And then you have maybe the longer drop or bomb higher payload drones as well, which can target bigger areas or positions, etc., and release their munition. Multiple different kinds of drones operating on different kinds of, some of the other ones have fiber optic delivery, although that's actually decreasing as far as I understand at the moment because they're running out of fiber optic cable. And of course you've got your artillery. So what you end up is this situation, what's going on in Ukraine, is where they have the defensive formations. They're in the rear often, and the battlefield is actually ahead of those in many places. And you have this drone coverage, which is 24/7, completely tied back to command and control elements behind the front line. And crucially, and this is probably one of the bigger differences, that drone coverage, the constant persistent surveillance, means that there's actually a tiny amount of soldiers holding a huge amount of areas. They're not really holding it in that sense of like units. I used to be in the infantry, like units holding and grouped together of a bunch of 30 soldiers here and then there and crossed over. It's single or a couple of blokes in a hidden, basically, and barely even a bunker, like just basically tunneled underground, but with the Starlink connection and the radio connections back to this drone headquarters. And therefore they're told they don't need to get out of there. They don't need to observe anything. The drone is doing the observing. Unlike when we were I was in the army. And as a result of that, you basically have this system where the drone is doing all the watching. And unless small amounts of soldiers are trying to work their way quite quickly through this, you could call it a front line, but it's kind of like a dispersed area, and not be detected by the drones. And the only thing the time the soldiers have to get out really is either to advance to take ground, which is highly risky, or to basically fight off an attack, which is happening probably with only a small group of soldiers near them, and the drones need support. Essentially the drones can't do it on their own. So that's kind of like the broad laydown of what this defensive belt looks like. I mean, it stretches for as long as a drone it ranges. So, you know, from 50 to 80k, either side of that, what we could call a kind of frontline or contested zone. And one of the most interesting things here actually is the way that the Ukrainians this spring, a little bit before, stopped trying to kill Russian soldiers as their primary kind of target. Somebody clever has stepped back and said, look, what is the center of gravity here amongst the Russian attacking forces? And it is not the fact that they're able to recruit soldiers for, you know, 60 grand a year from really poor areas of Russia and then throw them into meat grinder attacks against the Ukrainians. Targeting individual soldiers does not change the Russian operational approach or where they are on that spectrum of victory defeat. What they've decided is using these drones, forget the soldiers really, they're expendable and we do have to deal with them, but we're targeting the logistics and the command nodes behind them and their ability to resupply. And this is where the drones really can have a defensive force multiplier in terms of disrupting attacks before they even happen, because you take out the logistics supply and that's kind of slowing down the whole attack, no matter how many Russian soldiers are able to bring to the front. I think really the key takeaway is it's becoming much more difficult for Russia to, first of all, get any kind of armor or massed formations to form up. And then you need that to try to restore maneuver. The idea is you break through with an armored force. It spans out behind the enemy lines, creating chaos. And then through that comes your follow-on forces, your infantry, etc. like that. Those days, on that front at the moment, it's much more difficult to do that successfully. I wouldn't say maneuver is dead. It's not, but it's in it. We're in an attritional phase, and the technologies at the moment. You often see this in the First World War, like the introduction of the machine gun suddenly made trench warfare much more the sort of the dominant form of war. And then, of course, the railroads, which brought people up faster almost than you could build. If you're in a defensive position, the railroads got reinforcements to the defense area faster than you could build a new railroad to exploit that. You see what I mean? Tanks, of course, broke that. So these things go on. It's a part of the changing character of warfare. I mean, so what do I think? I think at the moment the Ukrainians really have the upper hand in defensive kind of warfare, and I think there's some interesting political things going on in Russia about what the effect of this might be. Do the Russians have the innovation and adaptive cycle to kind of break through this again? Let's see. I mean, they've been pretty smart at developing some of the fab bombs, which were then used, you know, the glide bombs, which used to hammer Ukrainian positions repeatedly and therefore heavily degrade them. But it looks like the Ukrainians have found a way of holding the line, which doesn't draw on manpower, because that's what they're as much on manpower, because that's what they're very short of vis-a-vis the Russians. I think we're sort of seeing they're trying to get going in a couple of areas and they haven't got going, you know, and that's quite interesting because, as I mentioned, they're basically stopping, you know, so far they're grinding towards Konstantinivka, but you know, so far this thing has not materialized because the logistics and the command and control is getting obliterated before they can even form up for an attack. I don't think that, you know, first of all, I'd say the adaptive cycles, if you look at the major weapons which are changing the character of the Ukrainian-Russian war or a new tactic, it is basically you're on 6-month cycles, you know, between the working out of a problem, adapting to it, its introduction, and then a change. And I think one of the other ones is, you know, we haven't mentioned, is just this increasing use of UGVs, so unmanned ground vehicles. And these are basically small, very small tanks with often a machine gun on them if they're in attack or defense mode, a weapons platform, like a heavy machine gun, like a 50 cal, or they can be used for that logistics on the last mile, the area. Well, it's not the last mile anymore, as we know, it's deeper than that. But the area where there's contested rear space and it's very dangerous to move for anyone to bring stuff up. And they're being used to extract casualties, for moving explosives up, ammunition around, etc. But crucially also in the operational phase of kind of like either holding positions. So just instead of having a bloke, you know, sitting in this bunker as I was with an overhead, you can pop your machine gun mounted on a UGV. It's obviously got loads of sensors on it. It can be directed by a human as well, linked to the command system. And that is, you know, there's reports of like a machine gun on the Ukrainian front holding a position for a month, you know. Doesn't mean it's in constant combat for the month, but it's been able to, if it's well positioned. One of the other things about this is one of the real areas of weakness, and you see this sometimes when there's Russian breakthroughs, actually, is when the Ukrainians try to move a full unit out of the front line. Because, of course, that's when it's weaker, because the Russian drones will pick up the unit moving in, and that unit doesn't actually have the experience of the ground or the threat in those initial first weeks. So that's always an area of major risk if they're trying to basically do a relief in place, as we call them. Electronic warfare spectrum is really important, especially with the decline again of the FPV. So if you end up with some game changer there, which is probably unlikely across all the spectrums, but you could see that, you do see these kind of things happen. The Ukrainians surge forward with a new innovation, and the Russians counter it with a new counter drone system potentially. So that would be something to look for. I also think actually some of the most important strategic stuff here is, like, as we've moved, like in the Second World War, you move from the kind of tactical operational battle, and that's one important part of what's going on. But, the drone strikes in the last 24 hours on Moscow were really significant, if you ask me. The ability, once that ceasefire was over, to just really hit Moscow in the middle of the day with multiple drones causing fires for the civilians is really not a good look for Putin, whose whole thing was, security and stability at home. Of which, he's probably killed now 1 million Russian soldiers or so. So I'd say that's the most, potentially that would be what I'm looking for beyond the battlefield, that long range deep strike, which is drone based. And for the summer, what would I expect? I mean, in some places, the Ukrainians probably can't hold everywhere, even given these kill zones, and given the appetite for the Russians, in terms of them taking casualties and it not changing their calculus. So I would expect in some places some gains. It's whether they translate into that and they actually break through the full rear lines, etc. Would be another thing entirely. But let's see. We might have a better. The Russian probably thinking at the strategic level is, let's see how this summer goes and see where we are. And of course, the Ukrainians are inflicting costs on them and trying to change the calculus in Moscow to come to basically to admit defeat and either hold the line where it is or something more catastrophic inside Russia potentially happening.